This is a story about the night that changed my life forever. It's June 1998. I'm just about to turn 10 years old. We live in Huruma Estate. Back then, it was famously known as Huruma Slums, a place of very interesting things: high crime rates, Huruma flats, which was like the upper middle class of the time, and burglary, gunshots, crazy, crazy things. And we were living in a single room that had like a small sort of compartment for a kitchen. The apartment we lived in had a bar at the ground floor, which was known as Trigan Inn. In fact, that was the name of the apartment too, because it was like a focal point for so many people that used to come and drink. And one of the most interesting things about Trigan Inn was there used to be so many robberies. So, you know, gangs would come and rob the bar, take all of the money, and flee. And some nights we would have really young boys being killed by CID officers when they got tip offs from the public that these guys were around. And you can imagine standing on the balcony and just watching these loud shots, and somebody who was trying to run away or flee from the police is just gunned down. You're 10 years old, you're just watching all this hula baloo. And it was scary. It was a scary place. But then beyond that, there was also chaos happening in my home now. We lived on the first floor of this building that had a bar on the ground floor. So that meant for so many nights, you could barely sleep because music was loud and they would close really, really late. I was, by that time, a class six student at St. Mary's Donholm, where my dad also taught. And this first floor of the building had, I think, like 10 houses, if I can remember well. So on this fateful night, so in this house we are living me, my mom, my dad. I'm the firstborn, so it was only me and my brother, who was 2 years old at the time. Then we had my uncle, who was my mom's brother, and our house help. Really tiny house. They had divided the single room with a huge ass curtain where it separated the living room from the bedroom. So we had these five-seater chairs on the living room side, the kabati over there, TV, and I used to shikanisha the small one-seaters as a place where I slept, and the house help slept on a mattress on the floor, and then my uncle, who was really tall, slept on the longer sofa. This particular night, my dad comes back home. Now, dad is a teacher, and we had a lot of educational books at like textbooks at home, which made my home environment boring because it felt like coming from school to another school. Because my dad was just too much into you have to read, you have to read, you have to read. And most of the books I was reading were not fictional books. They were not books to help with my imagination. They were just books about getting formulas and remembering so that you can pass your exams. It wasn't really about developing me as a person, right? And so I hated that because I don't know, I think I had a neurodivergent brain from a very young age, which are things that I came to learn later about myself ever since I was in my mother's womb. But then life was just really rigid because dad was just a hard man, and they used to fight a lot with my mom in that house. And above that, it was also the beatings that I used to get as a kid. um, Whenever I was deemed to have done something wrong, now my punishments would range from being beaten by slippers to belts to being told leo unaoga na maji baridi. So I still have a phobia for cold water to date because my body still registers it as punishment. So you can imagine how I suffered much in secondary school where nobody cares about what you went through in your home. And sometimes you'd be told you're sleeping hungry, you're not having dinner as punishment, and you'd just watch everybody eat and you sleep hungry. And those were really some traumatizing kind of things. So I sort of had a getting used to being beaten and being almost dehumanized in some sense in our home. So this particular night, my dad comes. It was just a normal weekday, and I remember it was around World Cup 1998. So it was being held in France, and I remember the goal, 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 ale, 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 and I was supporting Brazil because Brazil was just the team to beat back then. And I remember Ronaldo being R9 being like somebody I used to revere so much. But then the number 10, Rivaldo, was just for me somebody I was more attracted to, I think, because of his just really calm demeanor. He just had this calm sense of him as a person. So those were my favorite players back in the day. And that's the context of the time we are in now. So my dad comes back home and he starts to look for something and he doesn't tell us what it is. So he removes all these boxes that he had that had all these books about school things, education and whatnot. And for about 30 minutes, he's looking for these books and he's not finding. He's looking for something and he's not finding it. And so he utters to us that he is looking for a Bill Cosby novel. I think it was a book by Bill Cosby that he thinks he has misplaced. Now, that time, Bill Cosby was huge. He was massive. We used to watch a show on KTN. I can't even remember its title, but we loved Bill Cosby at home, and he was a funny guy. My parents enjoyed their own comedy. I even remember watching The Simpsons with them around the same time, actually. And he's looking for this Bill Cosby book, and it doesn't look like he is tracing it. So for all this time, he's looking frustrated, and I come to learn that he had borrowed it from a student he used to tutor, and this student lived at Huruma Flats, which was the sort of bougie place by the standards of the time. I don't know about now. So it was an expensive book, of course. And being that he had lost it, it definitely meant he either had to buy it, which meant spending, um, or he really had to find it. So something in his head tells him that I could have taken this book. Now, I was okay, a cheeky boy, 10-year-old. You'd steal your mother's 5 shillings here to go and buy Mutura or Patco or whatever, Britannia biscuits and stuff like that. I didn't particularly like books actually because I felt as though I'm being forced to like books. Because at school, I've been reading the whole day, all these lessons, 40 minutes per lesson, and teacher in, teacher out. And then at home, I really just wanted to relax, wanted to come home, watch the Pinky and the Brain, Bigfoot or Pink Panther, and just relax and just be a child or go out and play football. And, my dad didn't like that I loved playing a lot, so he would restrict my time to be outside. So anytime I came back home in the evening, it was all about you have to finish your homework. There's no time for relaxing. So the only time I'd get to relax was when I was having my evening tea. Then that's the time I'd watch cartoons before everybody else comes back home because I'd be home like around maybe 5 to 6 p.m. thereabout. So he can't find the Bill Cosby book. And he says, ama ni wewe umechukua hiyo kitabu, or are you the one who's taking that book? So in many of our African homes, when you're being suspected of something, it moves from suspicion to accusation really quickly. And that was my home. And so he starts asking me, in this house, who's going to school? You're the only person going to school, you're the only person dealing with books. Can your mother steal a book? Can your uncle steal a book? Can Akinyi, the house help, steal a book? So you're tongue tied because I mean, I had seen this book before. I remember it having a white cover with a picture of Bill Cosby somewhere, but then I was never interested in such huge books. In fact, stealing a book perhaps felt to me like a bank heist or something because I really never was interested in books as much. In fact, it took me so long to start reading for fun, or reading for pleasure, reading just to understand the world around me and inside me, because it everything just felt academic about books. Again, I'm having a teacher at home for a dad. So really, I hadn't taken that book anywhere, and I think in his head it's because I'm a cheeky boy, and it definitely meant if this book isn't in this house and he doesn't seem to remember where it was, it could only point to the fact that perhaps I'm the only person who's probably stole it. And so we start this back and forth, and I'm like, I haven't taken this book. I've seen it for sure, but then I haven't taken it. So somehow he gets convinced that I'm lying to him, and he starts beating me up to confess that I've taken this book. And I was a really tiny bodied kid. You can only imagine what a 9, 10 year old boy looks like. And already being used to being brutalized in your home, the place where you're supposed to be feeling safe. So my body just starts getting ready to defend itself. And what I do, usually I would try to numb myself so that he finishes with his psychosis of beating me up because they were really thorough beatings. And then he lets me go after the so-called punishment. But this night was not like every other night. I guess because the stakes were high because this was a really important book. But I came to learn later, as I will narrate, that there was something else going on, and I was the one who was sort of like the scapegoat, where he would, pour all his anger about what was happening in that time, as my mom told me some 20 years later. So I don't have the book. I haven't taken the book. Remove the book. I haven't taken the book. Sijachukua kitabu, sijachukua kitabu. So back then, my mother used to hang clothes like many of our moms. They would hang clothes using these telephone copper wires. There were these black, hard rubber copper wires that had copper in between. And, there were some rows of them just outside the balcony. And he walked out and came back with just something above a meter long, and he ordered me to strip my clothes. So while I'm doing that, I'm still denying, yo, I haven't taken this book, I haven't taken this book. And the adults in the house also don't know what to do. And most times, because he was the quote unquote head of the house, he'd mostly do what he wanted and nobody would stop him. And so, in the power dynamics of the house, I was the least because, again, my brother barely spoke, and I was the only child that anybody could peg anything on, and I couldn't defend myself. So he starts beating me naked, and my dad used to whip you. He used to whip you with all his soul, like all the anger of that was going on and brewing in his head and in his body would just get out, and he would beat the fuck out of you, like it was always so intense. His eyes would get red and like it was nasty, nasty, nasty. So you can imagine a boy that young, that small, being beaten up like that, and he'd like, yeah, remove the book. And so this wire that was really hard on my body, it started just, stripping parts of my skin, and I started bleeding. And so in like 10 to 15 very intense minutes that felt like 50 days, uh, it was just toa kitabu, I don't have the book. Remove the book, I don't have the book. Umepeleka kitabu wapi? And I'm like, I don't know where the book is. And so you're crying, you're sweating, you've started to bleed, and I'm starting to feel my body weakening. And I'm like, you know what, bro? This guy is not letting you go today. So you have to figure out another way to get out of this mess. And so, indeed, yeah, sometimes I would lie to get out of shit. And this time, I hadn't genuinely taken this thing, I hadn't genuinely done any mistake, but I still had to lie to get out of the situation. So I said that I had taken the book. I can't remember where I said I took it, but he left me. So I'm on the floor. Everybody else in the house is just watching. And these are things that later, when I came to think of them, it was just like you people were watching when this guy was doing all this. My mom, my uncle, the house help. He gets out of the house and he comes back with a sisal rope as if he'd planned all this. And he ties my hands. So I'm just on the floor, like, you know, tears. My body is hot and in pain. And my dad tells me words that have never really gotten out of my mind. He said, I'll do something to you that you'll never forget. And he looked so angry. His eyes were red and it was just some mess. Then he goes into the kitchen and comes back with the kerosene jerry can. Some of you call it paraffin. It was like this 5-liter jerry cans that we used to buy paraffin with. I remember even that time, 1 liter of 5 liters of paraffin was like 60 shillings. I wonder how much it is now. And he opens the lid of the jerry can and pours some of that paraffin on the lid, and then he smears it on top of my hand like this. And then he also had a matchstick, the matchbox, right? And he strikes the matchstick and puts that flame on top of the place he'd smeared the paraffin. So I have this little scar here. If you look properly, I think it's visible. So I think my brain blocked the pain that I felt in that moment, but I do have memory of look. I remember my skin frying, like it was bubbling up because that was the effect. I was burning. You're you're a 10-year-old. Like, which parent would do that to their child if they really cared about that child, whatever this child had done, for God's sake? And this again was a book. It was a fucking book. I just couldn't reconcile the mode and intensity of the punishment with the so-called accusation. They just weren't matching. But I remember feeling as though something had been taken away from me. Like something I didn't have a language for. I felt like somebody had stolen something from me that I didn't know what to call. But all I know is I was never the same from that day. I was never the same. I was never the same from that day. I think I caved in. I used to be a very outgoing child. I just caved in. I got quiet. In my head, I'm thinking, Kwanzaa, what happened is after that night, I remember the next day waking up, I was very weak and my mother was sort of bandaging me. I couldn't go to school for a couple of days. But then life just went on as if nothing had happened. I don't know if he bought another book. I don't know what happened after that. I was a troubled child, but this was a night that just epitomized all sorts of pain I'd been through already as a kid. But then there was nobody I could talk to about what's going on. Nobody ever asked me how I'm doing. But then my mental health started deteriorating and nobody was noticing. My life was really crumbling just around me, but nobody was noticing. So, I mean, you're expected to continue with your life, go back to school, continue doing your things, make sure you pass exams, be a well-mannered boy, be a good pupil. There was no teacher who could notice something was off with me. Um, my mother, as she would tell me later, she would generally describe me as a quiet child, but not interpret anything into it. Which I find that pretty fascinating. And I turned 10 anyway, and France win the World Cup in France because they were hosting the World Cup. I think it was their first World Cup to win, and I remember Emmanuel Petit scoring the third goal. I think they beat Brazil 3-0, if my memory serves me right. Ronaldo was pretty slightly injured at that time, so he didn't have his best game, and Brazil were quite kind of shell shocked actually that day. So my best team lost that time, but then I think it was also my first time to really appreciate the strength of France as a team. Le Bleu, are they? Yeah, and I get to 11, I get to 12, I get to 13 years old, I get to 14 years old. At 15, I finish my, at 14, I finish my primary school. Then I go to my Form 1 at a school in in Nyanza province called St. Joseph's Rapogi, which was in Migori County, Rapogi town, which is where my mom comes from. Now, initially, I had been called to Highway Secondary School, but it happened to be a day school, and my dad didn't trust that I would do well in a day school. So they found me a school which was all the way out there. I got a 399 out of 500 for my KCPE. He was really angry about it, saying things, hey, I have embarrassed him and all this stuff. Story for another day. But either way, I went to Nyanza, and there's a story there again where my brain just shut down, and that's where depression began for me. But then I didn't know what's going on in my head. I didn't know what was going on within my body. And I think I'll tell that story in another video because it's really important to me that we get to understand what child abuse, domestic violence, gender based violence affects people, but particularly for children and even boy children, and the kind of brutalization they are taken through in the name of discipline, that is supposed to be interpreted as a form of love, really damages their brain development, and they end up garnering some really deep seated self esteem issues coupled with undiagnosed mental illnesses to some extent, or in some cases. And many of us are walking with very deep wounds because if you're coming from a brutalizing home and then you go to high school and you're being bullied, and prefects are treating you as if you're just a piece of garbage, like those first years in high school that I witnessed, you just really struggle keeping your head together. By the time I was 16, I was already suicidal. And it's because everywhere I turned, I was being brutalized, I was being abused, and it seemed as though this was okay. This was the order of the day, and I didn't have any power to be against it. So I just knew when I was 10 years old, somebody took something away from me, and that was my dad, but I didn't have a language for it. It took me almost 20 plus 25 years to figure out this is what was happening to me, and it had a name, and this is what happened to my brain that affected me in certain ways that led me to become a certain person in my developmental stages. And the reason I tell these stories is just so that, first of all, as a society, we have to understand violence affects children in ways that we may never even really get to articulate. And I know we are living in a context where religion tells you you have to beat up a child, or how we interpret what religion tells us about discipline to kids is that you have to beat them for them to be straight. And I often feel like it's that is always an escape to us admitting that we do not have enough skills for parenting. We do not have enough tools for healthy parenting, for that matter. And the more we continue abusing children, the more we continue being silent about violent homes, the more we are going to have more difficult relationships when these kids are growing up, the more these kids will keep continuing and repeating what they saw in their homes and in their culture, the more we are going to have more femicides, the more we are going to have um, more people staying in toxic relationships, the more also because trauma ends up affecting you physiologically. So you develop autoimmune diseases, um, the high blood pressures, many things, and undiagnosed mental illnesses or mental health conditions, and suicides will continue going up. All these things are connected. They're connected to the larger aspect of politics, where uh, the economic situations in the homes affect how people are relating in these homes, and it affects relationships and all that pressure. Most times it's men, being the traditional breadwinners, feel all this pressure, but then this pressure gets out, and the first victims in the line are women and children, their wives, their partners, and their kids. And so all that pent up energy remains in the home, because out here these men have to supposedly behave. So when they come back home, they just become all these monsters. And James Baldwin spoke about it when he was speaking to Nikki Giovanni in the late 1970s about, Nikki Giovanni was asking him, why is it that black women get the least of black men? And you can find that conversation somewhere on YouTube. It's like 2 hours long, worth watching. So my entry point to these long conversations that I'm going to be having about child abuse and domestic violence and its connection to patriarchy, politics, and economics, parenting, and intimate relationships is I want us to start getting more curious, to stop looking and listening to the noise that is going out here about, how relationships are supposed to be, what we've been indoctrinated into, and just start reflecting by going inside and thinking, understanding that all these are connected to patterns of what we were taught we are supposed to be, patterns of what we are taught masculinity is, or womanhood is, or parenting is, and all that. I just know I've had to work incredibly hard to get a hold of myself. Many people, many kids who went through what I went through don't make it out. They either become drug addicts, they get into crime, they become very violent people. But then when I looked back at myself, I never really liked violence. And it's not like I escaped it totally, because I've been manipulative to people sometimes to get ahead of them or to protect myself and stuff like that. But then overall, I've not lived or I've not enjoyed violence, whether it's it watch happening to people or it happening to me, whether I know these people or whether they're strangers to me. Like I've not really liked violence, and so I used to feel lost. Like, are you telling me that even with all these wounds I'm carrying, I can't escape this system? I can't escape what's happening in my home? And as I kept searching and searching, I came to realize there was something bigger to the violence at home than my dad. And understanding the big thing was one of the centerpieces of me finally starting to heal. But I'll tell you, if you stick here and if you subscribe, what it took to get to understand why my dad was violent, where this violence was coming from, how he grew up, his worldviews, the culture, the context, and all these things. Because I realized at the end of the day, he was also quite a wounded kid. But then I was waiting for him to come home to love me. But I had to mourn that that father was never ever gonna come home to me unless he healed the wounded child inside him.